Hi and welcome back. Today I'm going to be painting something inspired by my photograph of the beach at Cuckmere Haven. I'm not going to be painting it exactly, just using it as inspiration and trying to paint a nice pale but interesting sky if I can, and capture how atmospheric and windy it is on the edge of the beach on the estuary of the River Cuckmere. The first thing I've done is to very simply sketch in the basic horizon line, the position of the trees and also the position of the breakwater, keeping it very simple because this will be a guide as I paint. I'm going to be painting onto the dry paper when I paint the sky, so I'm starting off with a very weak dilute mix of raw sienna, which I'm putting across the page with a small squirrel mop. Next I'm going to take my large squirrel mop, I think it's a size 22, and this is cobalt blue, again very dilute because I want to keep the sky nice and light. Got a lot of water in my paint and it's running down because my board's at an angle, so I'm trying to blend the two colours together so that I retain a little bit of this sort of yellowy brown glow in the sky, but get some shadow. This is a bit of sepia, the same kind of water to paint ratio, plenty of water, just a bit of paint to introduce some darker clouds across this side. I'm leaving some unpainted patches of white paper because that's really nice for giving a nice lively fresh look to the sky and implying sort of little white bits of cloud. I'm strengthening up my cobalt blue a little bit across the top right corner because watercolour always dries a lot lighter, so I want it to be a little bit darker than that. This is raw sienna. I'm going to sweep that across the beach to get the underpainting started. I'm keeping my brush strokes very loose and very quick, skipping over the paper in parts to leave some nice dry brush texture. I'm trying to just build up an underpainting that will work well and be fresh enough to work well in a loose painting. I'm adding some burnt umber and sepia, and I'm also adding some slightly darker paint across that tree line that I sketched in on the left side. My sky is running a little bit here, so I've dried out my squirrel mop brush and I'm just carefully smoothing out some of that texture in the sky that I wasn't so keen on. I'm now going to let it dry completely. So it's all bone dry now, so I can begin work on the more detailed parts of the painting. I'm very happy with the sky wash. I think it's nice and clean because I didn't fiddle with it too much. This is a mixture of indigo and sepia. I've mixed up a couple of puddles of paint of medium consistency, and I'm painting around or along the top of the little fence that I noticed in the photograph. So I'm leaving the fence area unpainted and painting these trees over the top. Sometimes I'm dipping into more indigo and other times more sepia, so that I get this sort of blue-brown kind of variation of colour for these distant trees. When these trees are dry, I'll come back and paint that fence, but at the moment I'm trying to get the trees in around the fence. I think you can see the variation of colour, and also I'm making a slight variation of tone. Sometimes I'm dipping into water so that I get a slightly more diluted mixture. This is my small calligraphy brush, and it's a very useful brush for these kinds of brush strokes. I'm trying to pull my brush strokes over towards the right because that's the direction that I want my windswept trees to be. In the original photograph, you can see some hawthorn trees, I think, that have really blown in one direction, leaning right over into the wind. And so I'm trying to focus on that direction with my brush strokes so that I can kind of get the look of the wind blown bushes even on this kind of just general mass of trees that I'm blocking in at the moment. Direction of brush strokes can be very important when you're painting something, so always think about that as you paint as to whether you want a particular direction for your trees to sort of bend into. This helps as well because it helps with the composition, and it helps to lead the eye across into the centre of the painting. Now is a few sweeps of very dilute Paynes grey, and then some more raw sienna rather, to continue to build up some texture on the beach. I'm picking up a bit of indigo as well, and getting that into the beach as well, particularly in some shadows across the bottom edge on the left side, beginning to sort of introduce the idea of the left side of the painting being in a little bit of cloud shadow, whereas the right side of the painting, which will have some figures in it on the horizon, I want to keep much lighter and fresher. And then I'll start putting in a little bit of shadow underneath where I'm going to be putting in my my long wooden broken breakwater. I'm using Millford paper. It's 140 pound weight, and it's cold pressed. It's taped to my board, and my board's at an angle of about 45 to 60 degrees, and that means that the paint will slowly sort of tend towards the bottom of the page because of gravity, and that helps with getting the shadows to the base of various parts of the painting. So I think it's always nice to have your painting on a slope if you're painting sort of using the wet in wet technique, which is what we're doing now. Now that the foreground is nice and wet, then it's become a wet in wet area to paint. Whenever I add paint, it's gently sort of softening and diffusing into the foreground and giving me some gentle transitions of colour and tone. I'll just keep working like this until I like the way it looks. And this is my stiff bristle brush, and I'm flicking some drops of indigo and Paynes grey, and then next I'll be using some sepia, and I'm flicking that into the wet or damp paint in the foreground, and this will again diffuse very gently but will give me some nice texture hopefully, and the start of some shadows in my, and maybe stone textures in my foreground. I eventually want it to look as if there are some sort of larger stones and rocks and pebbles in the foreground, but I'm not going to be working on painting every stone across the beach. I'm now going to leave the foreground and midground to dry and then come back and carry on. It's all nice and dry, and the first thing that I'll do is paint in this fence. I'm using a 1/2 inch flat brush here, and I've got a medium mixture of sepia just on the tips of the flat brush and using fairly uneven strokes, but keeping them in that unpainted area. I'm using these vertical marks just to give the impression of some fencing across there. And that's fine, that's done. I'm now going to move on to painting these distant trees just on the edge of the bluff. As I say, I think these are hawthorn trees, and they're really distorted by the wind that comes off the English Channel across this beach. They're really leaning over in this one direction. So using a mixture of indigo and Payne's grey and my rigger brush, going to try and just paint in the simplest few lines to try and indicate this small stand of trees. I don't want to overdo this. But I'm hoping that using these directional brush strokes will be enough to suggest these trees really leaning into the wind. And this is the way they grow all the way across the valley at certain points where it's very, very bleak and very open to that constant wind that batters the coast. I'm making one of the trees a bit stronger than the others, a bit darker, so it looks as if it's a little bit further forward. I'm trying to keep my rigger lines very fine towards the ends of these branches and trying not to put too many in. I want these to look quite stark, but I don't want them to grow to become too big. They have to be in scale, as these little trees are more like bushes than anything else. They're only probably about sort of, I don't know, 9 feet tall, something like that. And even though there aren't any trees in the photograph, I think to keep the painting balanced, I'm going to add a few of these bare twiggy trees coming out from these bushes here, this sort of tree line, just some taller ones. I'm going to lean this one over as well, so this helps to guide the eye across to those other leaning trees. Some slightly darker paint into the main tree there, the foreground, well, the one that's furthest forward, and that just differentiates that tree from the ones just growing behind it. And to finish off my horizon line, I'm going to paint in 3 figures. This is to represent myself, my daughter and her boyfriend on one of our visits to this beautiful beach. Keeping it very, very simple, just painting the impression of the person. Now another one. Right on the top of the bluff. And then the third person I'm painting joined to this figure here. Trying to get them to sort of lean slightly, but not too much, in a similar direction to the wind. So again, it creates that impression of movement in the painting. And that will do. So working down a little bit lower across the painting, the next detail is going to be these wooden posts of this broken old breakwater. So I'm starting off with my 3/4 inch flat brush and just trying to get the sort of distance between the posts. I want it to look like it's, a single entity, i.e. a breakwater, but without it being too blocky. So I'm working on the proportions, and then I'll change to my smaller 1/2 inch flat brush as the posts get smaller, as the breakwater goes further up the beach and up that slight rise, disappears closer to the top. I don't want to put too much detail in, but there needs to be some horizontal planks joining the breakwater. The whole thing would have originally, I'm sure, been covered entirely with horizontal planks, but a lot of them are missing. They've been rotted away or broken off by the sea. So I'll just start off, rather than copying the photograph, putting in a few here and there and see how it looks, and then I'll add them to my breakwater in a way that works with my painting, rather than trying to slavishly copy the photograph, because in the photograph I think the breakwater looks a little bit too heavy. This is my very large Chinese Haki brush. I've taken some very dark dry paint and I'm now dry brushing it right across the beach, because it's time now to really build up on some foreground texture. And next the flat brush, and get a nice flat wash of Payne's grey and indigo across the bottom corner and running along the edge. I'm painting over the tape so that my shadow across the beach is sort of looks fresher if you do a larger sort of brush stroke, and then going back to adding more sort of shadows and detail underneath the breakwater here and there, and then trying to integrate that into my beach. Now, using my large Haki brush just with water on it, I'm using horizontal sweeps of the brush across the beach, and this is slightly disturbing the paint underneath but bringing it all together. So all those different shades and tones that I've got there are now going to merge a little bit and become more sort of unified, more harmonious. I wasn't overly happy with the textures that I'd created, so decided just to smooth things out a little bit more. And I think you can see that now the colours that are there are working a lot better. I think my tones are now dark enough. I've got enough colour variation across the beach as well. I just need a bit more texture. So continue wetting that whole area and making sure that there's enough paint there, because the next thing I'll do is take the corner of a store card, a plastic store card, and I'm going to run that through the beach in sort of horizontal marks, moving the paint around to create these sort of drifts of pebbles, and then I shall create individual rocks and stones. As I etch through the paint, it exposes the paper underneath as paler and then moves darker paint around, and it's starting to give me those textures that I wanted. As I said before, I don't want to paint every rock and every stone, but I need to have enough there to suggest the pebbly beach. Now that I've etched through some marks like that, this is sepia and bits of Payne's grey, and with the tips of the small Haki brush, I'm putting shadows underneath those exposed areas and between them, just to build up a slightly more 3D look. I'll leave that area to dry a bit and then come back in and put some really nice darks into the stones and pebbles. But for now, I'll carry on working on the wooden poles of my breakwater, darkening them up in some places with the flat brush. Watercolour will always dry back a little bit lighter, so you do sometimes have to just keep building up these nice layers until you get as dark as you want things to be. And now I'm going to go back to my small calligraphy brush and some nice dark Paynes grey, and I'm going to work that between and underneath and around all those little stones. The idea here is to try and unify all those little marks and textures together, but without overdoing it, putting enough darks into that bottom corner so that when the viewer looks at the painting, they kind of follow the beach marks and stones up and then follow across the breakwater to the trees and eventually to the figures, which are the focal points, standing against the light sky on the horizon. If you paint along with this, you probably won't need as many brushes as I use. I tend to just have lots of brushes in front of me, and just as I'm painting, I just grab whichever one I think I'm going to need. And I go through quite a lot of brushes when I'm painting, but you don't need to chop and change as much as I do. This final detail is just adding some things that look like little bits of rope hanging off the breakwater, little bits of this and that, something and nothing again, just to add a little bit more interest to those poles. And finally, just a few more lines and little marks and dots and dashes around that beach area, just to continue with the suggestion of stones and rocks and pebbles. I think that's just enough to bring the painting together without adding too much detail. As I say, I wanted this to be very loose, and I think I'm quite happy with it now. So here's the finished painting. I'm going to remove the tape and have a look at it. I can always make a few adjustments if I need to, but looking at it with a nice white border helps me to see the painting in sort of a fresh light, so to speak. And I think I'm quite happy with that. It's got that kind of light but fairly dramatic sky, and there's enough movement in the sky and directionality in the trees, and the composition as a whole, I hope, and the brush strokes to convey that it's a nice sort of bleak and windy beach. I'm very pleased with the figures. They're nice and simple, but they work well as a sort of fairly stylised but loose focal point. Thanks so much for supporting this channel through watching, and I hope that was helpful. Thanks so much to my lovely Patreon group who support the channel, and I'll see you again soon. Take care, stay safe, and happy painting. Bye.